Hello, everyone. I'm Qi Mingpeng, Secretary General of TCP. You are wondering what is TCP? Is the Taiwan Climate Partnership. And our founder is there. AUO, Delta, TSMC, Microsoft is an ICT company in Taiwan. And they are not also the local company, it's an international company. Because we found the importance of climate change. About 3 years ago, we organized together. So that's why in the beginning, we have only about 8 founding member. Right now, we have 100. And this year, we also opened one financial institute, the Fubon Holding, to join us, the only one, because we know the green finance is very important. So today's topic is green finance. And we know, everyone, we want to climate change. The finance is the most important things. Although I am a meteorologist, I know everything about the finance. I work for finance, every day living by finance. But for the climate change issues, the green finance, how to do this is very, very important. Even when we talk about the nuclear, EU tax money, something, everything linked with green finance. So today we have 2 speakers talking about that, and we also have friends online to join us. And we have 2 speakers. The first speaker is Dr.Charbel, Moussa, and he is a partner and Decarbonization and the Climate Risk of KPMG Netherlands. And the second speaker is Sean Kidney. He is a CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative. Very interesting about this. So maybe later on we can have a talk about this. Charbel, maybe the floor is yours. You have about 15 minutes. Is okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I welcome all of the audience online. You can ask questions in our chat room. Okay. Please. Yeah.
You can use this micro. Okay.
Can use this one.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. No, it's working. No, not yet. Okay. Okay. So thank you so much for everyone online. Also, welcome. We hear a lot about climate finance. You mentioned the importance of climate finance. Already, the first few days of this COP, there has been a lot of talks about funds being initiated and about money starting to flow into funds. What I will talk about today is actually a bit more from the financial institution, because of course the big funds being announced by governments, etc., those are mainly public money that flows through governments. But for real economy, it's the financial institution who basically fund projects, fund activities, and today how banks and or financial institutions are positioning in climate finance is quite important. So what I will talk about, and then I will hand over to Sean, who can talk maybe a bit more about the tool and the vehicles of this channeling, is how banks are usually approaching real economies. The first thing is, today, when we look at climate finance from a financial institution, of course, it can flow into any activity that is labeled green. But where we see mainly the focus is in 5 key sectors: oil and gas, commercial real estate, iron and steel, power generation, and cement sector. Now, why these focus? Because you might think that, hey, oil and gas is not really a climate finance or a green finance. But for banks to decarbonize their portfolio, they need to address the portfolio companies or the finance they give to oil and gas sector. The same for the cement sector, because ultimately, if we are to decarbonize our economies, we need to decarbonize all the sector in the economy. And those sectors are basically the carbon intensive or the most hard to abate sector. So only providing finance to renewable energy or alternative energy or energy efficiency is not enough to decarbonize our economy and to go to net zero, because we will be leaving behind the sectors that are carbon intensive. And this is why today, if we look at how banks or financial institutions are positioning towards greening their portfolio, we see that, for example, cement and iron and steel are becoming important all over the world, even in Taiwan, if they export their product into Europe, especially today with CBAM. So attracting funds and being climate, let's say, or have targets towards a net zero is very important for company in order to remain competitive in the market. Now, when we talk about, okay, there is a lot of terminologies out there on greening the financial institution. You might have heard of GFANZ. There is SBTI, of course, the Science-Based Target Initiatives. They have a guidelines for the financial institution, but there is also the NZBA, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And today, a lot of companies are a bit confused, like, what can we do? What do we follow? What is best to attract funds? There is no right or wrong. Each initiative has its pros and cons. Okay, let's have a discussion. Let's have a discussion. I would love to have a discussion, because indeed, if we are going towards climate science, the gold standard is the SBTI, and the SBTI today help organization in order to achieve a zero carbon economy. However, we need to recognize that our economies need different approaches per sectors, because some sectors are harder to abate than others. This is where the NZBA, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, comes into the picture, because it's a sector alliance that is very much aligned with SBTA, but takes into account the reality of the banking sector. And this is why there is a little bit of flexibility into NZBA guidelines versus SBTI guidelines. If you can see that both initiatives have a very big attraction into the financial institution. NZBA, of course, is much more recent than SBTI. They are aligned with SBTI on the longer term, but they provide a bit more flexibility on the short term, specifically around the decarbonization of financial institution portfolios. But again, SBTI is really the gold standard toward a net zero 2050. Now, if we are, or if a financial institution would like, before today providing just climate finance, financial institutions are starting to put certain targets in order to put a dot on the horizon, and then the financial product or the financial finance they are providing, it's toward these targets. Now, the Science-Based Target Initiative does provide a lot of sectoral guidance approach that banks or financial institution can use in order to determine criteria for their sectoral companies, and then accordingly provide a climate finance or green finance, or establish new type of solution, financial solution. The Net Zero Banking Alliance, they are also developing, but because they are more recent than SBTI, they are developing sectoral based approaches. As I mentioned before, overall, today banks are still trying to figure out how to approach basically decarbonization of their portfolio, how to provide climate finance, and how to remain real to the economies. Because even if banks would like to provide all their available money towards, let's say, decarbonized projects, and there is not enough of projects, then banks will be out of business. So what we see today is that in general, within the financial institution, and maybe a bit in Europe, there is an availability of fund, but not necessarily enough availability of project that meets stringent criteria. And this is why banks, especially European banks, again, are looking all over the world for project that meets their criteria. I will not go into too much about how SBTI treats the approach versus NZBA, but it's quite important to know that even SBTI today, which is again following the science, do treat different sectors differently when it comes to net zero. On the long term, all sectors need to get to net zero by 2050. This is what the science tells us. But in the next 5 to 10 years, so when we look at 2030, 2035, not all sectors can achieve the same emission reduction. Some sector can achieve 40, 46, 50%. Other sector can only achieve 20, 23%. And SBTI have taken this into account, and this is starting also to affect how financial institution takes their target and basically channel their funds towards the different sectors. NZBA is very similar, but again, NZBA on the longer term is aligned with SBTI. On the shorter term, there is a little bit of flexibility. Now, when banks set their ambition and then they set, let's say, new type of product or vehicles in order to channel climate finance, we see 3 key action being taken. The first is they determine the direction of travel for net zero. So the direction of travel for net zero is at which pace they want to start channeling climate finance. What percentage of their portfolio they want to allocate to what sector. We are not, as KPMG at least, we are not in favor of exclusion policies. Because yes, banks can say we don't want to finance on the short term at least. We don't want to finance, let's say, oil and gas. We don't want to finance cement. We don't finance steel. But the reality is our economy still needs those sectors. Our economy has not yet pivoted in order to have new type of concrete or new type of steel or only green steel. This is why, rather than going through exclusion policies, it's today banks are setting certain roadmaps and direction of travel that include the pace of decarbonization, and they are channeling their funds according to this pace of decarbonization. The second thing is they are aligning with the industry initiatives. So it's not really a top-down approach where banks say, I will do, 50% reduction in the cement industry, because simply if the cement industry cannot achieve 50%, the banks will not be able to achieve this on their own portfolio company. And the third thing is they are not taking all sector at one go. So they are really selecting or prioritizing the sector where they channel their climate finance. And this is quite important in where we see when it comes to attraction of climate finance is that the sectors that are working to get technologies or green technology or low carbon technology better embedded into their operation are starting to attract funding or are starting to engage with financial institution better. Now, if I talk a little bit about regulation, of course, there is CBAM, and this CBAM is putting pressure on non-European company to implement initiatives or technologies that are low carbon. But next to that, there is the EU taxonomy that is providing stringent criteria on what can be called as, let's say, green finance or sustainable finance. EU taxonomy is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it does provide a level of credibility, and then it does incentivize company to channel funds into activity that are considered sustainable. On the other hand, some activities in certain sectors that are not considered sustainable, like for example in the chemical industry, are starting to have a little bit of challenges in attracting finance or in attracting, let's say, enough finance. So even today, we start to see that the that the EU taxonomy that was mainly driven from the financial let's say, flow of money is also starting to have an impact on the companies themselves that wants to attract finance and that wants to be part of the EU taxonomy to take measures themselves to be aligned with sustainable activities, so to speak. Now, what do we see in general? Banks going around a certain journey in order to determine how to deploy their green finance. And this journey starts by looking at their portfolio, start at understanding their own portfolio and prioritize which company. Then, as we mentioned, basically determining what ambition they want or what is the direction of travel they want to take, which sector they want to take first, which sector they want, or which activities in which sector they want to channel their green finance or what they label as sustainable finance through, right? Then they set targets in order to make sure that part of their portfolios really go into those type of activity, and at the end, they take action. What we see today, in again, challenging, is three scenarios. The first is climate finance. People think that climate finance carries more risk than normal finance, which is not necessarily the same. Because let me give you an example. Today, if we go to take car loan, whether we're taking a loan for a fuel-powered car or electric-powered car, the risk on the loan is the same. Now, of course, in certain assets, especially in certain industry with heavy assets, we go into different type of risk. But I wanted to mention that not every green finance has necessarily a differential risk profile than normal finance. As such, not every green finance should be maybe a higher percentage or a differential percentage than conventional finance. Scenario two is that today there are certain green technology that have been very well established and they have proven the business case. Their climate finance should be cheaper than conventional finance. And the third is basically the new technologies that still are not well understood, where the risks are not yet fully, let's say, calculated. And this is where we see a differential, especially a positive differential in the interest rate versus conventional finance. And the discussion here becomes, if you are providing us finance that is more expensive, how basically are you incentivizing the implementation of these green technologies? So this is where we see now most of the discussion. But like any technology, we follow the technology curve, and those technology will become less risky or de-risk at one point and will attract hopefully better finance. So this is what I wanted to say for now. Thank you so much, and yeah, open for the discussion. Really, really keen on it.
Okay. Maybe, but I have a quick question to Charbel. I'm wondering the G-Fence. You mentioned about the banks. G-Fence is a big umbrella, and you mentioned about the banks. But I know some of the banks claim they just joined, and they have the ambition, but what they think is they cannot reach the goal at all. There were lots of difficulties about this one. What's the situation right now?
Again, we have to recognize that net zero and decarbonizing our world, there is a lot of talk, there are a lot of pledges, but we know that actions are not fast enough. We are not, not me saying that, IPCC is saying that, we are not doing enough to meet or to be on the trajectory we have to be on. Okay, now, banks can make pledges, but ultimately, if the real economy doesn't move, banks cannot meet their pledges. What we see today is that the decarbonization of the key sector in our economies is not going fast enough in order to decarbonize our economy at the pace we need. Today, there has been many banks who said, I want to decarbonize my portfolio by 20%, by 25%, by 40% by 2030. They can ultimately, what is the levers they have? They can say, I don't invest in a company anymore. Okay, fine, but this goes ultimately against business. Or they can engage. And today, banks are engaging with their clients. So they are moving from, or at least there is a move from exclusion to engagement. So rather than saying we don't give fund, we engage, but engagement put them at a basically certain position of control where they cannot force company to act, but they can incentivize company to act. And if company don't act fast enough, banks cannot decarbonize their portfolio fast enough. So to answer, long intro, but to answer your question, banks or some banks were quite eager to be very ambitious, but then they are facing the realities of the real economy. And this is where today there is a big discussion like, okay, you know, where do we position? Do we position ahead, or do we position as an enabler for the real economy to decarbonize?
Oh, but your data shows that very limited banks joined the alliance. Not every bank. What about the others did not join? What's their future?
I cannot speak, but again, like many initiatives, and hopefully again Sean will mention, any initiative starts with, like yourself, you start with the launchers. You start with the one who launch, and then you build momentum, and year after year. Now, the fact that SBTI or NZBA have so many banks already today, right? It's something that we should build on. There is enough momentum to build on. But again, not every bank in every economy. We have to recognize that some economies today, decarbonization is not necessarily priority for them, right? So not every banks today is in the same position as maybe, you know, the global banks or banks in advanced economies.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, let's welcome the Sean Kenny. Okay, you can use this one.
Use that?
Your boss.
Hey, I have options. This is great. This is what we need, options. It's challenging. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We're a global NGO working to mobilize capital for climate action. Let's just understand what we're dealing with to pick up on some of the comments my friend said earlier. We had last year, the G20 commit to 1.5 degree maximum warming on the planet. You might remember the Paris Agreement said 2 degrees, 1.5 if we can, because major nations were not willing to commit to 2. Climate science has advanced since then. Climate science will tell you very clearly 2 degrees is unsustainable. Our planet will be unbearable for human beings at 2 degrees, and we trigger so many feedback loops, we will see warming of 6 to 8 degrees by the end of the century. Unbearable. Understand the ramifications of this. If we do continue on what is still the current trajectory of change, we will expect to see changes to the global environment that will make it impossible for human beings to survive. This is an extinction event that we're looking at. This is not about creating a slightly more comfortable future for our kids. On the current trajectory of climate change, we are looking at substantial risk of extinction of the species and many other species with it. We already have the highest level of species lost on the planet since the meteor hit Yucatan years ago and wiped out dinosaurs. This is human-induced, but we're doing it to ourselves. That's the background to all of this. Now, the bad news about the G20 target agreed last November is that according to the World Meteorological Organization, we will actually get there in 2027. We've lost already. It's very important to understand this. We have failed monumentally as a species to address what our own scientists have been telling us very clearly now for the last 35 years that we have to do. The crazy thing about this is it's not hard. The solutions are absolutely clear and present. Yes, it is challenging, but from a technology perspective, there is no barrier to the change we have to make. Technology will improve the speed of transition, but we know how to do clean energy. We know how to do green steel. We know how to do low carbon concrete. We know how to do sustainable agriculture. None of these things are research and development. None. Yes, there's some cost issues, but the truth is our economy has been managed with public policy constraints for the last 200 years anyway. We make decisions to make seatbelts compulsory in airplanes to stop people dying no matter what the cost. We just do it, then everyone has to follow. We make decisions to electrify our societies and stop people burning wood everywhere for a variety of reasons, including cost. We just do it. And we're in that similar kind of position in life. We do need to understand, because we have failed so spectacularly, climate change is happening. Typhoons in Taipei are going to be 2 times to possibly 3 times as intense by 2050. We have to prepare. That will mean changing our building codes. That will mean changing our coastal land management planning, because we're going to get tsunamis, or tidal waves, I should say, coming through. We're going to get more floods, as we saw in Taiwan in the last few months. We're going to get droughts in between. Resilience is now a big agenda item. That's the bad news, but it's important to just understand this is not a small issue. This is not about how we gently change things. This has, because we have failed to act, now become a cliff we have to jump off in terms of change. Okay, positives. We are lucky in one way. We do have the solutions. They have to be scaled up. They have to be made cheaper. We have to invest in learning rates, as we have done, by the way, in things like the semiconductor industry in Taiwan over the last 30 years, where the cost of doing semiconductors continues to drop. We have not done that in key areas of change, apart from solar and wind, where thanks to the German government in 2001, and then the mainland Chinese government in 2006, we have seen extraordinary state-backed investments in renewable energy, which has driven the price down. It has not been clever companies. It has not been R&D. It has been large-scale offtake agreements by governments that have allowed the scaling up and therefore the lower cost reduction, which has driven that particular sector. We need to do this in lots of other areas. The scale of capital we have to invest in solutions is around $150 trillion US between now and 2050. That's a lot of money. But we are lucky because we have the capital available on the planet. In Japan, in China, in Europe, and in the US, we have managed to accumulate large pools of long-term capital in our pension funds and insurance funds. We have the capital. Incredible. At the same time as we have a species-defying problem, which is going to involve about $150 trillion of investment, not cost. We have the capital available to us. We have proof that capital will move. The green bonds market that I've been developing has grown from $2 billion outstanding to $4.3 trillion outstanding globally now. Hey, it's tiny. It needs to be 10 times that. But that is an extraordinary development. It's a proof of concept. The main problem we have everywhere around the world now is supply, is bonds that we can invest in. I can bring lots and lots of investors to play who will happily participate in green finance. They simply don't have the product. And that's the real issue. So that's why KPMG's work is so important, because from my perspective, I don't care about the net zero bank transition plans. I simply care about green bonds being issued that my investor base can invest in. That's good news. We've had a couple of wins. In 2021, the Biden climate pulled together major commitments by the world's developed countries around emissions reductions. Okay, so far so good. But it did one thing amongst the investor community, because every major Western country committed, and then China and India in the back of it. Investors now are of the view, right, the future will be green, the future has been decided. They're mainly concerned about now speed and winners and losers. How do they pick? Which company is going to survive this change that's coming through? But that's a win. There is now a belief that there is a tidal wave of change coming through the global economy. First, renewables, which we've seen already, hydrogen, but it applies to industrials, it applies to property sector, it applies to agriculture, land use, shipping, and aviation. Everywhere, and around this COP, there is talk of what the change is going to be, not if it's going to happen. Even the oil and gas industry, even Exxon has come out and tried to claim the space by putting big advertisements saying how they're part of the change. Unfortunately, their transition plan is nowhere near adequate enough, but we'll come back to that later. We've seen governments follow through with significant incentives. The IRA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, has been incredibly successful at generating investment around new technologies, especially, by the way, in Republican congressional seats. 80% of the investment is happening in Republican seats, which means it won't be rolled back, even if the Republicans gain control of Congress. That's a very important thing to note about that one. But in Japan, the Green Transformation Plan, which is a 120 trillion yen program, is on a per capita basis the same size as the IRA. Huge, incredibly important, with massive electrification of the Japanese economy and clean energy. And then in Europe, we have similar programs. And in China also, China this year has already built more renewable energy than ever before in history. It has been, for the last 16 years, the largest investor in renewable energy of any country in the world, and continues to be so. There is more renewable energy capacity in China now than in Germany's entire electricity system, and continues to grow. The other win we've had has been the understanding about risk. We've had a conversation at central banks going on for the last 10 years about the importance of addressing climate to mitigate future risk. The Network for Greening the Financial System, an association of 140 central banks globally now, continues to publish more material around this. This is important because this means that every bank now has to take into account risk issues in their portfolios from the point of view of financial stability. It's not about doing something for climate. It's about ensuring they are not going to be negatively impacted by changes in the economy, negatively impacted by climate impacts like flood, heat, or storms, and so on. These are material risks. By making it a risk discussion, central banks have taken it away from the ministries of climate change, where this issue was languishing for 20 years, and made an issue for ministries of finance and treasuries, by the way. And then part of that has been taxonomy development. We've been central to taxonomy development for the last 10 years. We created the first climate bonds in 2012, helped the Chinese in 2014, and the European Commission ever since. We've been driving taxonomy development, which has led to all sorts of other developments like disclosure regulation, which is driving banking changes in Europe, where banks and investors and corporations are now required each year to disclose their sustainability in line with the European taxonomy. A common language for what we do about climate change exists for the first time. 50 countries around the world are now working on taxonomies. We have this week published taxonomy developments with the Rwandan government, the Singaporean government, where Colombian government, the Australian government, and Hong Kong. We've also been working on their taxonomy for it. Guidance is becoming the norm. This is why I say it's actually a bit simpler than we think, because guidance about what to do is becoming reality. Transition is a new area. So clarity about what we need to do in steel and chemicals is now coming through, but it's still a work in progress. The third thing that's happened is incentives. First, the People's Bank of China introduced a requirement that all banks in China have to have 5% of their bond holdings as green bonds. That is a very powerful incentive, which has driven the Chinese green bond market. But in other countries, the Reserve Bank of India that we work with has brought in public sector lending requirements for green finance. The development banks of the world have now rolled out numerous green bond guarantee facilities. The Asian Development Bank is launching another one tomorrow around nature hubs and green bonds. This is now becoming the norm. We have an opportunity in Taipei, in Taiwan, this is a country that has a lot of fossil fuels. They've all got to go. And by the way, the taxonomy is forcing us to address some very difficult questions. One of the difficult questions has been the false stories we've been sold in the last 20 years about transition. The International Energy Agency said very clearly, early this year and again last year, there can be no new fossil fuel investments if we are to meet a 1.5 degree trajectory. Nada, niet, none. That is new gas as well as new coal. We will need to sweat our existing assets, but we must stop the drastic methane leakage problem that we now exist. We saw an announcement yesterday about that from the COP presidency. Change is happening. We need to change the energy system in Taiwan. We need to change the industrial base in Taiwan. We need to change the agricultural base in Taiwan to be aware, to address all of these problems. We need to make our economies everywhere around the world future fit. The reason I'm here is I think there's a chance that Taiwan could be a laboratory for the planet. We need laboratories. Singapore is becoming it. The government has decided to go deep green, has done amazing things just the last 12 months. We have Denmark doing the same, becoming a deep green country. Taiwan could do that. Could be part of a constellation of small countries that show the big countries exactly how to change very, very quickly. For that, we need you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sean. Have a seat, please. And also, Charbel. Okay, both of the speakers talk about the issue and also have some thinking about Taiwan. And okay, I have several questions, and later on I will open to the audience. I will focus on the first question. Will focus on EU tax bonding, because last year we all know the EU tax bonding used the nuclear and fossil fuels such as gas as a sustainable source of energy. It makes us surprised about this. Although we know it's because of the war of the Ukraine-Russia war. No. Maybe probably you can give us a very explanation about this one, the situation. And because lots of people think that nuclear power is green energy. Yeah. Okay.
Let me correct your misconceptions. I've been intimately involved in all of this. First, yes, a couple of years ago, Europe did allow a sliver of gas to be included. But understand that the conditionality with European inclusion is very, very tough. There will hardly any be. You can only build gas if you're replacing coal. You could only build gas to 15% of the generation capacity of coal. And you have to commit that that gas plant will be low carbon by 2035 in line with the International Energy Agency's net zero 1.5 degree pathway. These are critically important caveats to understand. This is not a message about gas being green. This is a message about meeting the IEA's tough transition pathways. And so far, we haven't seen any plans to qualify. So understand that.
But even with that, they don't attract EU taxonomy. They cannot be under EU taxonomy, gas plants.
Well, with those caveats, a gas plant could be, but it's very, very difficult, and there's been none so far. On nuclear, look, let's not fuss around here. Nuclear is low carbon. There is no debate about that. It is very, very low carbon. What is going to kill the species is not nuclear. I'm not a big fan of current nuclear technologies. I'm working a lot in Japan at the moment. Fukushima is a live issue for the population there. And I appreciate that in Taiwan, we've seen a capping of nuclear. But if you're going to close something, close fossil fuels before you close nuclear. I make this speech in Germany all the time. In Europe, we've recognized that. We've said nuclear is low carbon. The rules for building nuclear are quite tough. It is not an open blanket for nuclear. You need to address waste disposal, which is not being addressed very successfully around the world. However, we've understood that to achieve the transition for climate, the most important thing to do is to reduce emissions globally, and that's reflected in taxonomy. So yes, we count nuclear bonds as green bonds, and you'll see more of them coming through this year. But the International Energy Agency, in its own modeling, the best forecast we can have for nuclear is 8% of global energy generation in 2050. This is a diversion, folks. Let's get on to the real issues. That's renewable energy.
Yeah, Charbel.
Well, on gas, I think we agree. On nuclear, maybe slight nuance. Is nuclear low carbon or near zero carbon? Yes. Is nuclear clean energy? Question mark. Because indeed what you mentioned about waste. So for me, it's always about what is the boundary and where is the scope that we draw clean. If we are looking at operations, the actual operation of nuclear to generate electricity, we could say, yes, this is green operation. However, if we look at the bit wider value chain of nuclear, no, we do have to recognize that today there is an issue post and even sometime pre with the mining, etc., but also post mainly where material issues still align. How do we treat the waste in order to make it clean for our environment, for our planet? This is why indeed it's absolutely absurd that certain country closed nuclear in order to, or maybe not in order, but basically carried on with coal in order to provide energy security, right? Nuclear do provide energy security. They are a great base power, right? Very efficient. So moving away from nuclear because of a certain emotional trend, but then replacing it with coal, I think it's absurd, right? However, is nuclear low carbon and need to attract certain funding in order to enable the transition? Definitely yes, right? What do we label it? It becomes a matter of taxonomy after all.
Yeah, even if the COP28, several countries have the pledges triple the nuclear power. What's the connection with the green finance?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of terminology and it's a matter of taxonomy. So the EU has labeled nuclear as green power in order to put it under the framework of EU taxonomy. So today, from an EU taxonomy perspective, money can be channeled to nuclear and can be labeled as green. We just heard there will be green climate bonds going there. We need to recognize, again, getting to net zero, solving our issues, right? Solving the issue of extension that Sean just spoke about is not something that will happen tomorrow. It's a journey for the next 20 or so years. Ideally, not more than 20, 25 years. Ideally, otherwise we're doomed, right? And Sean mentioned this very, very clearly. However, those 25 years, we need levers. We need transition levers to go through them. We are not off a cliff. We don't jump from 10 to 0 straight away. And this is where doing pledges around tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, even nuclear, is quite powerful in our view.
You asked a specific question around COP. Let's be clear. Nuclear qualifies as green or low carbon for the purposes of NDCs. There's no debate about that. The risks associated with it are not to do with climate. They're to do with what I call do no significant harm risks enshrined in the European taxonomy as an idea. Different countries have to make their own decisions about can they deal with the waste issue and so on, and they may or may not include it. But it is low carbon. Let's be very clear about that. Does that mean that we're a fan of current existing technologies? We're not, because they're expensive, they're slow, and they clearly have operational risk. We've seen live experiments, right? So it doesn't seem like a sensible thing to do. France has decided it's going to build a new fleet of nuclear power plants. Okay, they're green, they're low carbon. They're not going to come into operation in 2046. I mean, that is not a fast solution. A fast solution is the next 7 years. No new nuclear plant will be built in the next 7 years if it started now. But we can do a lot of solar, a lot of wind, even a lot of geothermal. And of course, in high earthquake zone areas like Taiwan, you've got a real do no significant harm risk. Are you putting facilities in an area where you increase the risk of accident? That's just like lunacy, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. We open the question to the public. Anyone have a questions? Have questions or comment? Okay, please.
My name is Wan Chun. I'm a reporter from Taiwan. So as you all know that countries have a pledge to triple nuclear power, right? So what I want to ask is that because you are talking about climate bonds, right? Will there be more and more green bonds that meant to set up for nuclear power plants around the world? And like how much of the scale will be of that market? Thank you.
There will be more green bonds for nuclear. Canada's just done one. China will do more. Korea will do more. Will it be large? No. Are investors hanging out for nuclear bonds? No. They're worried about the risks. In some countries, in France they are, in Germany they are. So it varies a little bit. So no, this is a diversion. You know, it'll be part of the mix. As I said, the IEA says the maximum we can get to in terms of local nuclear capacity, global nuclear capacity by 2050 is about 8% because there are fuel constraints, the various other, hey, new technologies. There's a lot of VC money going into fusion at the moment. It might work. I mean, fusion has been the thing that's always 5 years away. It's been like that for 40 years, I think. So I'm not holding out any promises for it. SMRs look interesting, small modular nuclear reactors. It might work. These are not going to be big capex items. Where's the big capex going to be? in terms of investors. It's going to be in solar, in the energy sector, in wind, in grid connections. We have to quadruple electrification of the planet between now and 2050. It's going to be in green hydrogen. We have about a $10 trillion pipeline of investments in hydrogen and ammonia generated from renewables, which will replace fertilizer generated by gas around the world and shipping fuels and so on. There are many other things we've got to worry about, way more important than nuclear.
I have a question. You mentioned about, if I noted correctly, about 4 trillion at the moment under CBI, right? So the bonds that you mentioned, nuclear bonds, Canada, France, what is their value in the context of the 4 trillion?
It's in the tens of billions.
Still quite small.
Yeah, very clear identification, because when we talk about nuclear before, lots of the political issue, and this talk from the green finance point of view is totally different. So anybody want to have a comment? Yeah.
I have one question for both of you. Sean, you mentioned that taxonomy drive the banker to change. And then now I think a lot of pressure on the financial institutions' disclosure, transparency, on how they align with or complying with the EU taxonomy. And then the taxonomy has already spread out very fast, and a lot of, just like you mentioned, a lot of Asian countries already also leveraged the existing some of the background expertise and to develop their own taxonomy. But how about, can you just predict what will be by 2030, how taxonomy, because we know that even right now at EU is just only at the very beginning, a couple of sector and then 6 environmental objective, but the current clear taxonomy just only focus on some specific environmental objectives. So still have a long way to develop a comprehensive to cover all of the different environmental objectives and all of the sector. And then can you just share, and also Charbel can also share that according to your observation, how impact will be to the bankers to become much more transparent and really to leverage the taxonomy to drive the much more impactful consequence based on their finance. So can you share with us about this kind of a situation?
Well, first, one key misconception. The EU taxonomy covers more than 80% of the EU economy, right? There are 243 segments that are covered, not just a few. So it's very broad ranging. There are some areas that aren't covered. Agriculture, because the member states couldn't agree. They had too many arguments. So work to be done. We have, however, board agriculture into the many other taxonomies around the world anyway. So work does proceed apace. The first point. There are many issues we've got to address to create a sustainable society. You know, we need to ensure circular economy, resource management. We need to make sure that we rebuild our natural biodiversity, which we've demolished over the last 50 years globally. There are many factors, all of which we consider pertinent to the response to climate change. However, the first and primary things we have to do are around mitigation, around emissions, getting emissions down, and then preparing for the crises that are going to start now, heat, pandemics, etc., which are all part of it. We cover many of those things in the taxonomy. We're continuing to do more work on it. Taxonomies have now been published all around the world. As I said, Hong Kong and Singapore and Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, just some of the more recent ones. For banks, you said something important. You said banks have to be thinking about engagement. We would argue, and I'm doing a seminar for Japanese banks tomorrow about this, we would argue the primary indicator for banks is not their carbon footprint. I disagree, because it's too complicated. You know, by the time, I mean, we looked at how you manage the carbon impact of a trading desk. Honestly, it is what you'd call a problem that needs AI. It is impossible to figure out. too difficult. We could spend 30 years coming up metrics for banks around their financed emissions. We can do something very quickly. We can look at banks' clients and how many how many of those clients are addressing transition, are preparing, who's actually done, and then we can have some assessment about the quality of transition plans, which is coming through, as you talked about, of SBTI and so on. That engagement metric is, for me, the most important metric, because banks are enablers rather than the direct builders of power plants, the like. And that's how this will play down. So when it comes down to reporting under the European taxonomy, banks are required to report on the sustainable investments they've made, which is not the same as carbon emissions. What percentage of their portfolio is exposed to renewables? It's already getting simpler. And the next metric will be around transition plans and what their clients are doing. That's doable. For the underlying companies, of course, we need to have the reality of those transition plans, annual reporting, metrics that are linked to actual capital investment plans, action plans, and all these things. That work is the groundwork that's got to be done.
Okay. I would like to extend what you said, not to repeat, but very much similar to CBI. If we treat regulations, taxonomies as enabler to drive green finance and provide clarity and transparency in the market, it's great. We need to be careful by using reporting as the drive, because there we open a lot of rooms to use the wrong lever to start labeling things just to report on them. And I believe CBI, you stand in the front and not at the end of this change. So basically you say, according to these criteria, you can issue a bond, and then, okay, at the end, KPMGs, we do a lot of CBI assurance, and then yes, it ends up in a report. If you position at the reporting, then the risk, and this is what we see a lot, is that if the reporting is the stick or the carrot, then banks or other institution or other organizations start to see, how can I fit things in order to put in a reporting box? So a lot of today regulatory work, especially in Europe, is trying to close those loopholes from both ends of, let's say, this funnel. We have the EU taxonomy, and Sean, you mentioned the EU taxonomy led to other disclosures, and at the end we have also the disclosures coming up in order to really provide this transparency in the markets. Now, ultimately, banks, right, follow the economy, follow their portfolio companies, right? So banks can push and then can claim how they are engaging or how they are incentivizing or how much ultimately finance they are providing, but it's not up to the banks to claim how much carbon they are reducing. Because let me tell you very simply, banks can sit on their hands, right? Green infrastructure, let's say, go low carbon, grids go low carbon, their portfolio company benefit de facto, and the banks say, yeah, my portfolio went down. They haven't done anything on that. So let's be careful also, or the messages should be very clear on what do you report on and how to use the reporting, right? Not as a marketing engine, but really meet the beginning of the funnel in order to report what you are doing against the initial criteria.
Okay, thank you. I would like to finish all this session, and thank you all the two speakers. Thank you. Give applause.
Thank you.
For you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Let's
thank you.
photo.
Thank you.
Yeah, take a photo, please. Yeah, without, here. Here. Okay. So here.